Welcome to the 63rd episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvarg and my partner in ocean crime, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition.
Hello, everyone, and welcome.
I say crime because we've heard a lot on Rising Tide from Ian Urbina of the Outlaw Ocean Project and others about how the ocean remains a wild west when it comes to illegal fishing and other resource crimes, plus lack of effective law enforcement. Today, we're talking with Dr. Ian Ralby, the founder of I.R. Consilium, a company that focuses on solving these problems, providing advice and direction to a range of agencies about maritime law and security, resource crimes, and more. So, Ian, let's start as we often do. When did you first find yourself drawn to the sea?
Well, I think growing up in Baltimore, I was always somewhat connected to and in love with the maritime environment. I grew up during a time when Save the Bay was taught in schools and on everybody's license plate. And I grew up as a result understanding the importance of the marine environment to our life on land. But it was as I was entering both university and graduate school that I started getting more and more interested by how oceans are governed and how we operate both world trade, but also an effective regulatory system for the majority of the Earth. 70% of the Earth is covered in water. And so it takes a lot of collective effort to ensure that there is some degree of rule of law around those parts. And so as I advanced through undergraduate, graduate school, law school, I found myself interested by international conflict resolution. And in fact, I went to law school to do international conflict resolution. I was not entirely focused on maritime issues. In fact, that was very much a sort of a side thought. But when I took Admiralty and Maritime Law, I realized that that was one of the areas of law where you have a true practice in international conflict resolution in ports and coastal areas around the world.
I know during the height of the piracy off Somalia, there were certainly different navies coming in, and the shipping industry, or certainly the port states, were reluctant to see armed people on board cargo vessels, essentially. And yet it happened, and it happened where these contractors were floating on essentially offshore armories that were ships full of ammunition and weaponry. Tell us how you got involved in that and how it resolved.
Well, I was working on a PhD from 2008 to 11 on the regulation and oversight of armed contractors. And during that time, the flavor of the month was actually the armed contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as other conflict zones on land who were doing things that nobody really was paying all that much attention to. And then it was coming to light when something went wrong. And so the maritime, Blackwater and other companies, some of whom actually did very good work protecting diplomats, and others, some of whom ventured more into to troubled areas where they found themselves engaged in human rights violations and other issues. But I worked very closely with the Pentagon, the Swiss Foreign Ministry, the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and both the private security industry and civil society organizations concerned about both the human rights violations and the use of these contractors on a multi-stakeholder initiative to develop some kind of functional oversight. And then in 2011, just as that process was really starting to build into a meaningful mechanism, piracy was booming, and armed guards on ships protecting vessels transiting the high-risk area of Somalia became the flavor of the month. And so we did see a major boom in the maritime private security industry and the use of privately contracted armed security personnel on board ships. And we also saw this sort of outgrowth of a sort of a necessary support mechanism through floating armories that existed both in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, and some into the Gulf of Aden. But that whole industry continues to exist, and it continues to evolve. And so we are seeing different models, different mechanisms taking hold now. But it is a concern because, as we said at the outset, 70% of the Earth is covered in water. And there are a lot of places that are very difficult for national governments with the legal authority to actually enforce both international and domestic law to effectively reach and control some of what is going on.
When I was listening to some of the videos of you earlier, you were discussing the creativity of criminals and criminal networks. And can you give our listeners a little bit more of a picture of what you meant by that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the innovation of criminals around the world it can't be overstated. They have a very clear mission. They know what their goal is, and they identify where the blockages are, and they find ways around them. I often joke, despite being a lawyer, and particularly a maritime lawyer, that unfortunately the best comparative maritime lawyers on earth are all criminals. The ones who look legal system by legal system at where there are gaps, where there are deficiencies, where there are strengths and weaknesses. They're the criminals who are looking to perpetrate harm, and they find where there is a path of least resistance for themselves. And so whether it is the creativity in terms of using the law, for example, the law requires that a vessel render assistance to another vessel in distress. Fundamental to all maritime law is the safety and preservation of human life at sea. And so under the SOLAS Convention, a ship is required to render aid. So if a vessel is crewed by a nefarious group of people trying to get on board another vessel to perpetrate harm, one of the easiest ways to get on board, rather than attacking and actually physically boarding that vessel, would be to sink itself, request assistance, and be brought on board through that legal requirement for life saving. That is quite nefarious. That's quite both creative and evil.
And risky.
And risky. It is risky. But there's a lot of that kind of leveraging of law. There's also, of course, the more overt creativity of developing entirely new vessels, semi-submersibles or narco subs, as they're sometimes called, that skim just below the surface of the water, making it very hard to detect, even from nearby, to traffic drugs. And those semi-submersibles, those narco subs, don't dive and they don't surface. They don't ever really appear, and they're able to go not just between islands in the Caribbean or up the Pacific coast of South America, but they're able to go all the way across the Atlantic at this point, and that's a scary development.
And I think what people don't understand is really how big the ocean is.
Absolutely.
I was when I wrote my book, Rescue Warriors, the U.S. Coast Guard, America's Forgotten Heroes. I was with them on cutters guarding offshore oil terminals off Iraq, off the coast, looking for narcotics operators. They're saying, you take a go fast boat and you throw a blue tarp over it during the day. It's very hard to spot it out there in the middle of an ocean, no matter how much electronic gear you carry.
I think the first point you make is really worth emphasizing further and giving a couple of illustrative examples of just how vast versus how much capacity we actually have. The U.S. Coast Guard is responsible for 12,000 miles of coastline. That is one of its 11 key mission sets, is protecting our borders. And despite that is only being one of the missions, also ice breaking, search and rescue, counter IUU fishing, all these other things, they have fewer personnel in the U.S. Coast Guard than the New York Police Department. And that is staggering in and of itself. But then when you look at the actual vessel assets, the equivalent of what the U.S. Coast Guard has to patrol the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific is the effective equivalent of one police car for the entire U.S. west of the Mississippi. It's just mind-blowing when you...
Staggering. That is staggering.
It is.
They didn't want to talk about it, but during the BP oil spill, the Coast Guard has so many assets around the oil that they saw a significant uptick of both drug running and illegal fishing going on.
That's an inevitable consequence of any distractive mission. So any kind of hurricane, any kind of major event that pulls assets that would be devoted to law enforcement away to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief or some kind of other mission set will create a void that the very creative and very conscious criminals will seize upon. But to go to the oil point as well, yes, there are some very challenging vagaries, both in the law and in its enforcement. And one of the challenges is that there has to be a will in order to actually enforce the law. So there are laws that would apply to spilling oil and dumping oil out beyond 12 nautical miles and beyond the exclusive economic zone of any state. But the flag state of the vessel involved has to take responsibility. And right now, there are many flag states around the world who are not taking that responsibility. And that is a real challenge. But the other piece is that it is very hard to provide the level of detail in evidence to show that something actually has happened or has not happened, in order to be able to hold somebody either criminally or civilly liable for that kind of activity. And so, again, towards creativity, this is where we do see states being much more proactive lately in saying, okay, we might not have the laws on point for dealing with an oil spill out beyond national jurisdiction. However, if you provide us with a logbook or an oil record book or an incinerator record that has been falsified, you have prevented false statements to a law enforcement official of the state, and we have all kinds of fraud and other laws that can be applied to that. So ironically, the crime that some of these environmental crimes actually end up being about is not the physical aspect of harming the ocean, but of lying about it or providing fraudulent material about it once they get into the territorial jurisdiction of a state.
We just interviewed Monica Medina, who's the Undersecretary of State for Oceans. Very concerned about IUU, about pirate fishing, both for the labor abuses, the abuse of the resources, and really as a global food security issue. This is getting more attention and needs to get more attention. What's your involvement in dealing with IUU or pirate fishing?
Well, let me start by saying, as a lawyer, I grimace when I hear the term pirate fishing, because I think of pirates who are fishing, because piracy is a legally defined term under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. IUU fishing is a separate offense, and so blurring them actually does not help to actually focus our attention on what legal remedies there are and what operational remedies there are for dealing with each of them, because we have to be very clear and specific about where there is and is not law enforcement jurisdiction and who can do what about it. So in terms of my involvement, I spend a lot of time working with navies and coast guards around the world. I've worked in more than 80 countries around the world. I've worked with more than 120 coast guards and navies. And IUU fishing, no matter where you are, is something that navies and coast guards are becoming more concerned about. Some have been focused on it for a long time, but actually under the direction of our last commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, Admiral Carl Schultz, it has really gained some more domestic attention, and Monica Medina is intimately involved with helping make that happen, to recognize IUU fishing as a national security threat. For a couple of reasons. First of all, there is the issue of food security and food sovereignty, and that is a twofold issue. Food security is a hot topic right now, given the breakdown in grain supply chains following Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February. But many countries around the world are extremely reliant on fish protein for their dietary intake. Some countries in Africa in particular get 90% of their dietary protein from fish. And so any kind of incursion into the access to that fish is a threat to human life on land, because it significantly changes how people live, how people eat, how people survive. And sovereignty within the food space is also a big concern, because it is one thing to have access to enough fish or enough food to feed your people. It's another thing to actually have that access within your own sovereign territorial jurisdiction. And what we're seeing is not only a decrease in food security around the world, but also a decrease in food sovereignty. States that used to have abundant fish populations that were ample for feeding their domestic populations, their citizenry, are not finding enough fish in their own waters anymore. And that is where we have serious concern and sort of critical intersections of health, security, economics, and of course, maritime law enforcement. So that's I think why it is now seen more and more as a security threat on that front.
Why are these countries seeing a decline? Is it illegal fishing? Is it overfishing? Is it other boats coming into the countries? Set the stage for us on that one.
I think most of the world is incredibly sea blind. We live on land. We don't pay attention to the water. It looks like a vast space that, you can throw something in and it disappears. It's the big ocean. And with sea blindness comes another phenomenon, which is something I've termed wealth blindness, or maritime wealth blindness, where we recognize that the maritime space has some value. We kind of hear the mantra that 90% of world trade happens by sea. But what we don't recognize and really understand is how much value is in the maritime domain. And unfortunately, much like comparative maritime law, the people who understand the value of the maritime domain best are often those who would do it the most harm. And that is fundamentally where we do not see governments finding the political will to address issues of outright theft within their own coastal waters.
We gave one of our Peter Benchley Ocean Awards to President Macky Sall of Senegal because when he was first running for election, fishing communities were suffering, and it wasn't actually IUU fishermen; it was industrial fishing trawlers off his coast. And one of his first acts as president was to ban the offshore trawlers, and there was a almost immediate comeback of the domestic fishery. So the idea of artisanal, of protecting your local fishing communities against global overfishing as well as IUU illegal fishing has tremendous value.
I would agree, and I would add to that Senegal actually went further. I mean, I think the work of the Navy is commendable because they actually worked very effectively in an interagency fashion with fisheries in Senegal, and really focused on increasing their penalties. So they went from about $200,000 for as a maximum penalty for a vessel up to $1.8 million per vessel, and that then was enforced. So there were a couple of vessels that they were able to arrest in, I think, 2017 to 2018, where I think 5 vessels were arrested in a week, or 7 vessels were arrested in a week, and they got $5 million in penalties out of that. And then they reinvested some of that money into further maritime law enforcement capacity. And so Senegal is a great example of where prioritizing actually leads to a very direct and tangible economic benefit.
You mentioned earlier the impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was previous a lot of cooperation on high seas drift nets between like the U.S. Coast Guard and Chinese fisheries enforcement. That's gone away as China has refocused from protecting resources to extending power in the South China Sea, essentially using its own Coast Guard and fishing fleets as a way to project power. How is China both having a huge fishing fleet and also having ambitions to claim territory in the Pacific? How's that impact everything?
Well, I think one of the things that I work very hard on is to be rigorous in the analysis and assessment of Chinese activity and anybody's activity, including our own. And I think we have to be careful not to jump to call something illegal just because we don't like it. We have to divorce some of that. And so some of what China is doing is entirely legal. It may be incredibly undesirable from a geopolitical standpoint or even from a sustainability standpoint. But at the moment, some of what they're doing is within the law. That said, they do aggressively work to leverage their diplomatic and other relationships, their development relationships around the world, not just in the Pacific, to access, sometimes via almost development-based coercion, the opportunity to fish extensively or completely unsustainably in the exclusive economic zones of states around the world. They also do engage, and they have a lot of vessels that engage in IUU fishing. They engage in outright illegal fishing. And so we do need to be careful not to blur it all together into one. But having said that, I think that China has a strategy that they are using their distant water fishing fleet to not only project power, but demonstrate presence around the high seas of the world, not just in the Pacific, not even just in the Indian Ocean, but in the Atlantic extensively as well, in order to be able to make a claim, as they have in the 9-line claim for territorial sovereignty in the South China Sea, that they have traditional fishing grounds around the world and therefore should have some degree of sovereign rights. As regional fisheries mechanisms, the RFMOs are becoming more inclined towards developing some sort of sovereign basis for high seas access. There is, I think, a conscious effort by China to make sure that they are everywhere, because they actually have a strategy that says occupying brings about rights and interests. And that is part of what drives the distant water fleet to be so prolific around the world. Within the South China Sea and their territorial ambitions, that brings us much more into the direct expansion of China. China's interest is not the same as other expansionist powers are. China is interested in China, and they are always looking at what resources, what goods, what finances, what other opportunities will come back to benefit China. And that means that on the one hand, they are expanding territorial sovereignty in order to be able to have more of China, but they are also looking at what resources and access that brings them. And part of what they have done with the campaign of building artificial islands and then making a lot of legal fictions around them. They are very aggressive in sort of coming up with false notions of what rights accrue to an artificial island, and trying to even suggest that they would be able to exclude foreign warships and warplanes from the entire exclusive economic zone of their artificial islands. That's bogus. There's no basis of it in international law. But what they're doing is challenging the rest of us to say no. And unfortunately, whether it's on the law or on some of the fishing or on some of the other activities, our response is slow, and we are not ready and prepared to back up whatever response we have quickly enough.
And they also have this organized crime that they protect. And so touch on that briefly before we switch.
Absolutely. I think I work hard on distinguishing different categories of illicit and undesirable activity in the fishing space. On the one hand, we have IUU fishing. That is a sustainability issue. That is fisheries, companies going after fish in a way that is illegal, unreported, or unregulated, such that it diminishes the amount of fish that are in the oceans and the amount of fish that can be legally caught. And so that's one category. The second is fisheries crime, which is where we see the use of the fishing sector, the vessels, the infrastructure, the personnel, the financial mechanisms around it, the investment mechanisms around it, in order to perpetrate other crimes. So using a fishing boat to run drugs or launder money through a fishing company. Those are examples of fisheries crime. And it isn't actually undermining sustainability or impacting sustainability, but it is diminishing the integrity of the fishing sector. And then there's this third category, which isn't being talked about very much, but is very clearly a growing phenomenon, not just by China, but around the world. But China is the foremost and most aggressive perpetrator of it, which is state-protected illicit fishing, where China will actually use its state assets, be it the Coast Guard, be it its diplomatic assets, be it other state mechanisms, in order to protect IUU fishing. And that is a sustainability primarily concern, but it's a sustainability concern at the intersection of politics and international relations in a way that is very difficult for a smaller state to be able to combat.
We just signed, the United States just signed a memorandum on combating IUU and associated labor abuses. What do you think? Is that going to move us in the right direction? Just give me your perspective on that.
Well, I think everything that we are doing to not only raise IUU fishing, but create authorities and jurisdiction to do something about it is beneficial. It has not been prioritized either by us or by others as much as it could or should be. And so we are seeing a major increase in the attention given to it and into the recognition of its nexus to other issues. And so I welcome that. I welcome our involvement and promotion of things like the Port State Measures Agreement, which is a really powerful tool for ensuring not just a counter to IUU fishing, but a counter to the supply chain issues, where if fish is illegally caught, it can't then be landed in a country that is a member to the Port State Measures Agreement. And so we're really seeing a big increase in the tools at the disposal of those who are trying to combat the threats to our oceans in the form of IUU. And I welcome all of that.
And are you hopeful about technical cooperation? As you say, it's a big ocean. There are only so many Coast Guard cutters, but now using satellite trackers, requiring fishing vessels to carry AIS transponders. Are we going to get to the stage where things become more transparent and visible and enforceable?
Absolutely. And I think the philanthropic work of the likes of Global Fishing Watch, Trigmat Tracking, Skylight, the Pew Charitable Trust, Sea Shepherd, and others that are engaged in different areas of both maritime domain awareness and in essentially providing access capacity for some of the states that lack capacity, that they are really making this a lot, not only more transparent, but easier to do. And so I take a lot of optimism in the developments of just the last few years in our capacity to see what's going on and be able to effectuate a response. I think that we have grown tremendously in our technological capabilities. We have to catch up in our mindset and in our prioritization. The will is what is most important to build at this point, and that's why seeing the U.S. signing agreements can be quite helpful. In terms of technical cooperation, the other thing that I think we have to be really conscious of is where decision makers are constrained and what we can do to encourage them to recognize that nexus between ensuring a well-governed, secure, and well-developed maritime domain and the benefit to life on land. Because ultimately, if you are able to effectively govern the maritime space, it should be paying tremendous dividends for those who live in that coastal country.
Finally, as a consultant and advisor, what are your top 2 or 3 priorities that you're working on right now?
Right now, I'm working on trying to bridge this divide between security, governance, and development in the maritime space, recognizing that the 3 go hand in hand. And I'm working on trying to leverage the tools that are now at our disposal in order to be able to paint a more complete and accurate picture of what's going on so that states are able to find the will to do something about it. So those are my sort of 2 main objectives at the moment.
Well, we want to thank you so very much for being on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast. All the work that you're doing on an international level I'm hoping we will have great benefits down the road. And thank you so much for all of your work.
It's my pleasure. Thank you both for having me.
Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helvarg and myself, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein, with support from Natasha Benjamin and Ellie Curlow. Rising Tide's editing services and additional technical support is provided by Studio Cape May. The theme song is written and performed by Ethan Kenbarg. You can find Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, at www.bluefront.org or download it from Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free, the sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are. Good boy, Sparky.